My mic doesn't work, so they've given me this. So I'm a, former political hack.
Me too. Right.
Now, the Warsaw professor at USC, director of the Center for the Political Future, and I'm thrilled to be here with Joe Kennedy, who's a friend of mine, former congressman from Massachusetts from 2013 to 2021, the leader of a national grassroots political organizing effort called Groundwork. I think you'll discover he's remarkably thoughtful, very talented public servant, who's now the President's Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. So I'm going to start with this. In those 8 years in Congress, were any of your Republican colleagues also your friends? And do you see any hope for some constructive, even bipartisan progress in this divided government over the next 2 years?
Bob, thank you. Great to be with everybody. Good morning. Thanks for getting out of bed earlier in the morning to join us. I'm honored by it. Some of my closest friends in Congress were Republicans. I keep in touch with Republican members in both sides of the Capitol, the House and Senate, frequently. When we rolled out when I was nominated for this position as Special Envoy, within the first hour or two, I had 4 Republican senators that said they would help with confirmation. Turns out it's not a confirmed position, but they reached out right away. So yes, is the short answer. I will say, I think, Bob, that's gotten harder after January 6th. A lot of given what happened that day, particularly in the House, a lot of those relationships fractured, and I think it will take a long time for some to build them back. I was very fortunate to not have had to be there during that experience. But I also came at politics, kind of tried to do what I could to absorb it from a dear friend of yours and my late great uncle, Ted Kennedy, on the idea that your job was to find a way to address the challenges that affect us all. And for people that might be across the aisle from you, you should be as relentless at trying to find the areas of agreement and overlap with them as you are with your own colleagues. And so it was a dedicated effort to try to say, hey, we'll disagree on 99 things out of 100. Where is the one? What is the one thing we can find? And then you work on that. And if you are diligent about that and you come at that without judgment, and you recognize that those individuals were sent there by their constituents, American voters, to serve in Congress, it separates that a little bit from saying, I might think you're a complete wackadoo, but somehow you got elected. And if you're not there, chances are those voters are going to send another wackadoo there instead. So my job is to try to find a way to make this work. But that is a bit different than others at the moment whose, I think, don't view their job as to trying to make that work. They view their job as to trying to sometimes make it break. And that's a fundamental difference that I think has exacerbated over time.
Okay, let me get a little specific about that. As a predicate to a follow-up, let me ask you why Nancy Pelosi was so effective as Speaker. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And do you think Kevin McCarthy can get through the must-pass legislation like the debt ceiling without the whole process breaking down? So it's 2 parts.
Yeah. There are some historians here that are writing the book on the first part. And let me share one of many stories with you. But when I first got elected, I was given advice to kind of, as a freshman member of the minority party of the House of Representatives, you all know that where mushrooms grow and how they eat, right? You are not all that dissimilar from a mushroom, right? So spend some time, get to know colleagues, and if people want your opinion, they'll give it to you. So try to find those areas of overlap and get to meet folks.
Can you speak louder?
Yes, sir. Can I speak louder? And I don't know if they can turn up the volume of the mic. But so I was going around trying to meet a bunch of, doing one-on-one meetings with a bunch of more senior members of the House on Democrats and Republicans. And a couple of my colleagues suggested I go see one of the most senior Republicans in the chamber, who had been serving at that point for several decades. And so I go see this gentleman, and votes are about to get called, so we've got the House floor on television. And as we're kind of going through this get-to-know-you conversation, Speaker Pelosi comes on and starts giving a speech. And he interrupts me and points to the television, senior Republican, and says, our speaker, Republican speaker at the time, is not half the leader that she is. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, look, I disagree with almost everything she stands for, but she acquires political capital to use it and to change this country in the way that she thinks is best. We, Republicans, acquire political capital to maintain it, and that's it. And that is a fundamental difference between the two of us. And so when I think of Speaker Pelosi, look, we've all got our strengths and our challenges, areas of improvement, if you will, in all aspects of it. When the room got smaller, if there weren't razor blades sewn in those knuckles, it was pretty close. Some of you know her, some of you have seen her. She would talk about the need to engage in these battles and these fights, and then always say, and she would do it for the children, right? But she always understood, that there were challenges that confronted us, and her job was to shepherd our Democratic caucus forward to address them. And you saw John Boehner speak at her portrait unveiling. What a tribute that was to her, that a adversary like he was, and a former Speaker of the House, could say, though we did battle, you were always infallibly gracious to me, and break into tears at that unveiling. And what a tribute to her and her leadership.
You know what, I remember after the 2010 election when Democrats got shellacked after the passing of Obamacare, lost all these seats, she had a line, she said, you know, we came here to do a job, not to hold a job.
Yep.
So she was willing to pay that price.
I mean, look, it's a fundamental question that I think anybody should ask themselves. If you are fortunate enough to hold a seat in elective office, you're renting it, right? You had a successor, and you're going to have you had a predecessor, you're going to have a successor, right? You've got it for a period of time. What are you willing to lose your seat for, right? Nobody. Name me 10 members of the House of Representatives. Most people can't. When you think through, I would engage this with audiences when I'm doing town halls. You heard of this thing called Obamacare? Tell me somebody that wrote it. No one can remember it, right? They'll mention Obama, and as you know, presidents don't write bills, start in the House and Senate. The point is, they're not going to remember, most folks aren't going to remember individual members. So if you aren't doing this for your own legacy, you want to be able to say, look, I spent half my life away from my children, away from my family, enduring the just brutality of the day-to-day that job is, to have done something with it. This is what I did for it. And I think far too often, folks lose sight of that.
So what about McCarthy and the debt limit and, you know, the funding the government, all the stuff that has to happen?
So I'd say two things there, Bob. One, the things that have to happen will happen because they have to happen. That doesn't mean that they're going to happen without a crisis happening first. And I think that the real challenge here for those of us that are following this closely is that there are some, and a significant number within particularly that House Republican caucus, that actually want the chaos, because they want a fundamental shift in the way things work. And the only way they can do that is to essentially create mass governmental devastation to do so. And that's the challenge, and that's a challenge that Speaker McCarthy is going to have to wrestle with, is that for some of these folks, they need that system to break. And he can only lose 5, and there's more than 5 that need that system to break. The one thing, much has been written and said about the compromises Speaker McCarthy had to make to become Speaker, and I think rightfully critiqued for that. The one piece that I would add there, however, is it is not clear to me that another Speaker or another Republican leader wouldn't have had to make similar compromises as well. And that is, from my perspective, a challenge to the current House GOP of saying, look, you can put this at the feet of McCarthy at the moment, and again, I think some of that criticism is very valid, but if not him, who? And who else was going to be able to step into that position with the credibility where he or she wouldn't also have to make those concessions and also be at a similar position of weakness? When we went through this when I was in office with Paul Ryan turned that job down 3 different times. He said no, and they came back to him, and he said no, and they came back to him, and he said no. And he finally said yes, but he said it on these terms, which is a fundamentally different position to start in than Mr. McCarthy's in.
So let's talk briefly about the 2022 midterms. Supposed to be, most pundits said, a red tsunami. Instead, Democrats had the best performance under a first-term Democratic president since JFK in 1962. How did this happen? How Democrats actually gaining seats in the Senate, state houses, almost holding the House of Representatives? And maybe you can talk in particular about the role of younger voters and what you're doing with your Groundworks organization.
So I think there's a lot there, and with all due respect to me, for somebody in this chair to give you a really informed answer on that, I would turn around and ask Bob what the answer to that question is and regurgitate it all to you. So it's like a little bit of a false choice here. So I'd love to hear your response to that question. I can give you my couple of cents on it. One, to be very clear, is the Biden administration and House Democrats, the Democratic caucus, gave folks something to run on, right? By the time we got to an election, you had the most successful legislative session since President Johnson. And so when you turned around and said to voters across this country, hey, you elected us to do a job, and we might not have done everything you wanted us to do, but look at what we've done between the Infrastructure Act, the Reconciliation Bill, climate provisions, veterans bills, lining up to do a gay marriage bill, the successes that unique to a Biden administration was able to do through Speaker Pelosi's leadership in particular, was, I think, a validation and gave folks something to run on and go back to their districts and say, hey, look, this is what we've done. I think there was also you can't deny the impact of what a Supreme Court and the tilt of that court has done to an American electorate to start to understand that as powerful as legislative bodies in Congress are, in terms of addressing legislation, addressing our needs, and trying to put legislation forward, a conservative movement has created an end run around that entire process. And they've been very strategic about it, and it's been the result of a long-term, well-funded, and strategic campaign to dominate state legislatures, right, and tilt them conservative, and dominate the courts and tilt them conservative. And so what you have there, what we saw this past cycle, you had uniform control. Democrats had uniform control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, right, which most folks think is the way legislation is passed. And yet Roe v. Wade was overturned. And yet, out of Mississippi, federal question doctrine, the ability for federal agencies to be able to address issues amongst their mandate, that was dramatically reduced by a court case out of West Virginia. And once again, voting rights were under threat out of Alabama. Now, you won't hear from much in the media or the punditry that the real swing states in this country are Alabama, Mississippi, and West Virginia, and yet Alabama, Mississippi, and West Virginia gave 3 of the biggest substantive wins to a conservative movement in decades. And so I think while that connection hasn't been made writ large, I think there was a connection, particularly after Roe, of folks saying, hey, The court is now tilting very conservative. Other aspects here are in way of life are under threat. We saw those words written by Justice Thomas in one of the decisions explicitly about gay marriage. And so what then happened? You saw gay marriage protected by federal law. And so I think you are seeing a popular movement away from some of those provisions and some of those policies put forth by a conservative movement, and that did, I think, animate folks across the country. Last piece, without question, youth voters are this generation. It's the largest generation in American history. It's the most progressive generation in American history. You know better than anyone, Bob, they are still hard to reach. They are still hard to engage. But there's opportunities there for a Democratic Party to double down on that and find more and innovative ways to try to reach them. But there's also there's warning signs there too, to make sure that you no voter ever likes to be taken for granted. And if Democrats do just take a youth vote for granted, we've taken plenty of things for granted in the past, and that doesn't end up well.
So talk about groundworks, because you're doing something in addition to your role in Northern Ireland.
Groundwork projects I started when I was transitioning out of office, and it was the goal is to try to support local organizing efforts in places that often don't get support. So Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Plains. And I spent a lot of time when I was in office running around the country supporting other candidates in the House, governor's races, Senate races, everything, and wherever I was asked to go, I tried to go. That being said, in all of that time and all of those visits I made, I don't think anybody ever asked me to go to Mississippi. No one ever asked to go to Alabama. Nobody asked to go to Oklahoma. No one, right? Large swaths of the Plains or Deep South. I was the one surrogate that went into West Virginia for a couple of candidates a couple of cycles ago. No one goes. Why? Because you're not likely this next cycle to win a House seat or expand a House map in Mississippi. Other than Chairman Benny Thompson, you're probably not going to win another one. And the focus of an electoral cycle is always short-sighted. It is always the next campaign, the next race. You heard an awful lot about Senate races this past cycle. Mark Kelly in Arizona, right? Reverend Warnock in Georgia. Cortez Masto in Nevada. Come November, barring that runoff, right? All of a sudden, that's old news, and now all of a sudden there's 23 other Senate seats that Democrats have to focus on, and no one cares about those states anymore, unless they're up for re-election again. That is a fundamentally flawed way of actually building up the long-term support that you need to engage people in addressing problems. It's like if I told you, hey, you're suffering for a chronic disease, I'm going to provide you 3 weeks of treatment, and then after that, I'll come back to you in 8 months. Or for the Senate, 4 more years. Thanks. What about, if you're telling me that government is the way in which we address problems that confront our communities, why are you only trying to invest in helping us organize to confront those challenges for 12 months out of every 6 years? Or for 8 months out of every 2 years in the House? And a democratic structure hasn't made that long-term investment in these places. And we say, well, it's too hard to do. That's hogwash, right? The idea that there's not talent in Mississippi and Alabama, where did the civil rights movement start? Where was it powered by? It was powered by talented organizers in those places, right? We have just written them off. And what's happened as a result of it? You're losing voting rights out of Alabama. You lost Roe v. Wade out of Mississippi. Democrats don't campaign in West Virginia because Joe Manchin's the only guy that could possibly win in West Virginia. So what have we done? We wrote off West Virginia. And where did the EPA just get gutted? West Virginia. You can't take people for granted in democracy. But it is also not the structures of a party apparatus to go and make that long-term investment. A conservative movement has largely done that. A progressive movement has not. And so Groundwork is trying to build that up with a very healthy dose of humility on trying to start to support those organizers and individuals that have built up credibility in those communities, some largely on non-political, C3 basis, right? Just to say, hey, if you're concerned about mental health in your community in Mobile, Alabama, let's help you organize around mental health, around environmental justice, right? And try to help support those individuals that can be connectors and get people into a room to help galvanize, again, a community to address their challenges.
Yeah, you noted that President Biden has probably had the most, I think certainly had, the most productive first 2 years of any president in 60 years
Yep.
since Lyndon Johnson. Do you think he should run again? Do you think he will?
I think he should. I think he will. I think, as some of you might have seen this news leak out, his, as of yesterday, former chief of staff essentially said he would, so I'll take Ron Klain's word for it. I think he should. I think he's got a compelling case to make to the American public, not just in terms of the policy that he's been able to pass. And look, I'm obviously biased in this for a couple reasons. One, as you alluded to, he gave me a job, so I work for the guy. So there's that. The second, though, Bob, I think, is we haven't ever had this discussion explicitly, although I think we both know this, and you will hear it even from the likes of Mitch McConnell. There is not a more decent man in public life than Joe Biden. Right? And you saw the early critiques when, after he won, Republicans didn't say a bad thing about him personally. It was, oh, he's a decent guy, but he's been taken over by the radical socialist left, which, like, okay, sure. But they wouldn't criticize him personally, right? He is a truly decent human being. And again, my own biases here, but when our politics, the state of our politics has gotten so vitriolic and so coarse and so harsh and so dehumanizing, having a president that embodies that decency and is consistently throughout the course of his time in office has tried to find ways to bring people together. And times change, right? And issues have changed and people have changed. But it is just, it's an inspiring message from my perspective to try to say, hey, there's a way to do this where we can have passionate arguments about our policy because that's what democracy requires, while also understanding that character is defined by restraint. And there's lines that I will not cross because I don't want to debase an institution that I love, right? And for him, I think that's government, the presidency, and the Senate. And I think he has been characterized, and his leadership has shown that there's lines there that he won't cross, which is a testament to him.
So I'm going to follow up on two things that you said. His opponents may not have a lot to say about him that's negative in terms of, say, his character, although I think we're seeing some of that. But the House GOP majority now seems intent on investigating Hunter Biden, maybe the president, members of the cabinet, Dr. Fauci, maybe even impeaching the president. Is that good politics for the GOP, and how are the American people likely to react to it?
The House GOP doesn't need my advice on anything.
But they might be better off if they did take your advice.
I hope they don't. But look, look, you've already seen polls coming out saying, there are real challenges our country is confronting, real ones, right? At a national level, at a geopolitical level, at a local level, right? Challenges from how do we respond to climate, to what does it mean about how does the US effectively respond to a war in Ukraine, to local issues around policing and clean air and clean water. And real challenges in mental health, right? Real challenges that affect us, again, at a community level. And if you think that investigating Dr. Fauci is like the right way to use that power, like, go for it. You want to go investigate the quote-unquote Biden crime family, okay. You want to, they obviously won't do this, but you want to make a comparison here. Wonderful. The former president's daughter, while she was a White House employee, had a bunch of patents approved in China, right? Like, the Secret Service wrapped up millions of dollars in bills at his hotels, right? The idea that we're just going to somehow, obviously this is not, none of this ends up being objective or on a level playing field, but I think the more effort with which a House GOP tries to focus on one without acknowledging another, they are able to play to a base and animate a base, which again, all politicians and all politics, you have to do that to some extent. But you do that at the expense of a middle, which just says, hey, that's great. If I'm struggling to make ends meet, how do you address the cost of eggs? Right? Like, where's a congressional hearing on that? Because when I went to the supermarket last weekend, because I got 2 little kids, and we went to get, like, it was $10 for a dozen eggs. Right? And even I went, holy smokes, when did that happen? So, like, do that. And, this other stuff, I don't think that is where the core concern of an American public, when you wake up in the morning, that's what you're concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think back to 1998 when they were in the midst of impeaching President Clinton, and he called me and said, I want to put a couple ads on the air. Can you make them? And they were basically the environment, Social Security, education. And all these people want to do is investigate.
Yeah.
And for the last 2 weeks ran them very heavily, and Democrats actually gained seats in the House that year. I think it's going to backfire.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, has filed 5 articles of impeachment against Joe Biden. Like, and this is something that Speaker McCarthy is going to have to address, because they are now close friends, because Congresswoman Taylor Greene was essential at getting him that speakership. So if you're filing motions to impeach a president because he violated the law and needs to be impeached, like, that's the appropriate remedy, it's hard to file that and say, oh, I don't care, bring it up whenever, right? Like, if you're going to impeach a guy, you should move on that. And then you got other members of that caucus who say that won seats held that Joe Biden won at a New York state, that I say, is that really how we want to be spending that time? Probably not. And it's a difficult balancing act then for Speaker McCarthy, which...
Okay, my other follow-up, in this, you mentioned the corrosive time that we're living in politics. I think there's more bitter division than any of us, old or young, can remember. Are you hopeful about the future of our politics, and how do you envision the state of our democracy in 10 or 15 years?
Look, I'm hopeful. I'm particularly grateful that all of you are here, because one of my people that I just adore and I try to listen and learn from as much as I possibly can is Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's giving a speech opposite me, and yet you guys are here, so, like, not sure why, but thank you. But through all of her books, right, there's an element of hope. And, one of the other challenges I have in this world that Bob knows well, and Bob wrote some of these words, but no matter how well I ever did in political life, a relative always said it better, which is just a reality that I had to confront, right? But the challenges that we confront were made by us, which means those challenges can be addressed by us. The question is whether we, as a collective, are willing to do the hard work that's necessary in order to address them. So, look, we are at a time, yes, of political peril, but also extraordinary promise. And part of this question ends up being, are we going to be willing to do the hard work that we, not just our politics, but that we as a society are willing to do to actually address those concerns, recognize kind of common humanity, common concerns, and move our country forward? And look, that happens every day at a local level, right? Politics don't normally invade Little League games. You can find places with people across the aisle where folks are able to engage in that common bond and common practice. That gets harder as you move to higher political levels, more diverse from local reality, and there's a dehumanization, right? Some of you might have noticed that our former hero in Boston retired for the second time yesterday, right? They don't, Tom Brady, in case you didn't know who that was referring to. There's been plenty of things written and said about Tom Brady. There's been a few things that, like, recognize the fact that guys relatively young guy with a family and a couple of kids, and like all of this stuff, if you're him, is like, it's great to see it across SportsCenter and ESPN and Sports Illustrated, but like he's got a family, he's got young kids, those kids are absorbing this too. Like, it ain't an easy time. But there's a distance that is created that allows us to just sit back and throw haymakers at people. And there's a reason why we do it. Part of that is this life and public life, but part of that is, are we then willing to say, hey, there's some hard work that we have to do to resist that temptation to move beyond it. But it's better for all of us if we find ways to move beyond it.
Okay, here's a related question. We seem to have lost sight of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's adage that everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. Today, people and political leaders can pick their own news sources and insist on their own versions of the truth, which widely and wildly vary. What are we going to do in the face of these incessant claims of alternative facts and charges about fake news? How can we combat this apparent deluge of misinformation? And can we ever reach a place go back to a place where we can at least debate and decide based on a common ground of shared knowledge?
So, Bob, that's one of the core questions of our time, right? And I wish I had a great answer for you in that. What I will say is an adage here that you know very, very well. Physics and politics don't always align, but in the long run, the physics wins, right? Like, politicians can sometimes avoid the effects of gravity for a period of time, but at some point, gravity wins out. And so when I was in office, I sat on the science committee for a couple of years, and there was a strategic effort by some of the folks in charge there to try to discredit a highly respected study by the American Cancer Society that identified substances that ended up being carcinogens that were then regulated by the EPA to try to make our communities healthier. And there was an effort there to cast doubt on some of that science, to muddle the waters on the regulatory environment to be able to allow the deregulation for these substances. That effort, thankfully, was, up till now, has been not wholly effective, but it is a symptom of a larger effort to discredit science, which is, on the one hand, I can understand the politics behind that. I also know, and I'm certain, that science doesn't care what your politics are. And so in the longer run here, that science is going to win out. And again, I think, when the politics are on there, you've got to have that countervailing force that stands by and is willing to fight that fight to protect that science. But in the longer run, like when you say, hey, deny the existence of climate change, you can deny that. It is your right to deny it. I can't make you believe something different, but we can then start to shape those policies to say, hey, is it going to be, should the federal government continue to fund the rebuilding of communities that are built in a floodplain that was a once every 500-year floodplain that has flooded 5 times in the past 10 years? And we will not be able to afford to continue to ignore that science.
That raises a question that's always intrigued me. The congressional cycle's 2 years, Senate cycle 6 years, presidential cycle 4 years. Climate change, long-term problem. I have to give Al Gore a lot of credit. He saw it very early on, and after although I believe he got elected president, he just didn't get inaugurated. After that 2000 episode, he stopped being a politician, he became a prophet. Isn't it hard to deal with a question like climate change, where the effects seem to be off in the future, and politicians have to run for office in the short term?
So yes, 1,000 times over, and again, you know that just as well as I do. Aside from the fact that now you have the tragedy and luxury of pointing out that the effects are no longer off in the future, right? They're like right now, and you can point to the fact that Al Gore was in fact a prophet, right? Like he pointed to this, and others pointed to it a long time ago, and tragically, they're right. So look, part of what my effort, not to draw this connection too closely, but it is the basis for some of that work. If at a national level it is easy to discredit institutions, individuals, figures, because they are disconnected from your community, your hometown, you don't know them, et cetera. If you can translate those issues locally, it is far more real, it is far more affecting, it is far more tangible, which is part of the work that Groundwork is trying to do, is in communities that don't have large-scale nonprofit C3-based institutions, to help build them, to help create them, to help fund them, to help generate them, so that in places that aren't necessarily, that might have a couple of folks in an environmental justice movement that are cognizant of how climate change is impacting their communities in Mobile, Alabama, but they don't have the resources in order to actually scale that up and be able to touch hundreds of households instead are only touching a couple of blocks. Can we make that real so that they can translate that? Not trying to say, hey, we need your effort to go make sure an ice sheet off Antarctica isn't going to break loose, but to make sure that the local reservoir doesn't dry up. And how do we mitigate that? And how do we address that? So translating these issues, big macro or geopolitical issues locally, necessitates and requires a local infrastructure and local system that is able to translate those issues into local language and local knowledge and then generate that local support. And in a lot of places across the country, we haven't done that. And that's what I think a big piece to this is. It's not, we only have a couple minutes left here. I don't think I've ever told you this. One of my favorite political vignettes is, any of you see that movie Patch Adams? Remember that? Philip Seymour Hoffman and Robin Williams. Both doctors, they're competing about, great movie. They're doctors that are competing against each other for, at some med school. End of this movie, I promise there's a there, Bob. He's getting nervous over there. So they're rivals. End of this movie, something tragic happens to Robin Williams in that movie. Philip Seymour Hoffman comes to him and says, look, I'm the best doctor in this hospital. I can outdiagnose everybody. I know everything there is to know about medicine. And we've got a patient who's actually Betty White. And I know exactly what's wrong with her, but I cannot make her eat, and she needs to eat. You are the one doctor in this hospital that can make her eat. Will you help me get her to eat? And he initially says, no. And then he comes back and he says, you want to know how to make her eat? I'll help you. And the scene cuts, and she wakes up, and she's a patient in a hospital, and she wakes up in a kiddie pool full of spaghetti. And all she has on her face is joy and an ear-to-ear smile. And she has found, again, this lust for life. And that has always stuck with me, Bob, because Democrats are incredibly good at diagnosing problems. We are smart. We got lots of people that can run regressions and tell you what is wrong with you, tell you what's wrong with your community, tell you what's wrong with your science, tell you what's wrong with this and that. And we do a terrible job of treating. Right? And there's a big difference between diagnosing somebody and telling them what's wrong with them and telling them what's wrong with their community and talking down to them and belittling them, and then saying, what is it that you actually need? And there might not be a medical reason why you need to wake up in a kiddie pool full of spaghetti, but if that's what it takes for you to find joy so that you will eat, who the hell cares? So listen, spend time with people. Do the long-term hard work that is not going to get you 1,000 more votes in this congressional campaign, but that 5 years from now will get you 50,000 more votes so that you can, in fact, win a governor's race. You can't do the second without doing the long work, the hard work that you have to do, because people are people and they don't trust people coming in and saying, I know what's wrong with you. If you only trusted me because I went to some fancy school and got some fancy degree and I know better than you, we'll do better. That is a great way of pissing people off, and we're very good at it.
So we only have a couple minutes, so I'm going to do two last questions. Why did you pursue public office? In fact, you're still in public service. And I assume the example of your family played a role in that.
Example of family played a role in it, certainly. The most powerful experience I've had professionally, by far, was being a member of the Peace Corps. So I served in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic for a couple years after college. And I loved it. It was an incredible experience. I did not love every second of it. There's plenty of parts there that I can laugh at now. I certainly wasn't laughing then. But for me, who grew up amongst, in a very fortunate family and amongst extraordinary privilege, who had the benefit from the time I was very young to be able to have two parents that would say, whatever it is that you want to do, you can go do anything you want, right? And that success is going to be based off of my input into it: talent, hard work, work ethic, et cetera, right? Tom Brady didn't have to be fearful of me taking over his job, but that was because I wasn't a good quarterback, not because of anything else, right? The community that I lived in the Dominican Republic, no matter what they did, there was nothing that any of those individuals was going to be able to do, despite the fact that I was no more talented, no more intelligent, no more gifted than any of those individuals. There was nothing that they were going to be able to do that was going to get them to Harvard Law School, right? Life for them was always going to be a struggle to put enough food on their plate of their families. And the reason why was the structures of that society and the calcification of a political system that still, in a developing nation, was responsive to really powerful interests at the expense of the poor. And the best definition, you heard me allude to it earlier, the best definition of government I ever heard came from my predecessor, Barney Frank, who said a lot of things memorably, but this one stuck with me. He said, government is simply the name we give to the things we do together. Right? It's people sitting around a table trying to solve a problem that affects us all. And those structures of society affect us all. And I was incredibly blessed to be able to be grown up in a family that believed in public service, understood that people could help shape it, and understood the power of a system when you recognize people's humanity and dignity and then put in place the structures to be able to celebrate it, recognize it, protect it, and allow them to be able to achieve it. And if you can do that, and if you can see the promise of what happens when you do and the damage of what happens when you don't, if you have that chance, I want to try to take it.
Finally, we have 1 minute left. Why did you decide to go to college at Stanford instead of Harvard, where most of your family went?
I don't quote Ronald Reagan very often, but Ronald Reagan once said, if the Pilgrims landed in California, the East would still be wilderness, right? My dad, I got on a plane with my dad, I got a twin brother, and to visit some schools in California, and I'd never been out here before, and he was nervous, and my dad doesn't normally get nervous, and he was like, what are you worried about? Like, East Coast kid, and family's close, all the rest of it, And he went, wait. We walked around the quad at Stanford, I looked at him and was like, what are you possibly thinking? Why would you choose to live in Boston when like this exists? Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Okay, I think we're at the end.
There you go.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.